surveil the Gospel of Matthew and its eschatology, Lord, in 24 and 25. Lord, may we understand and hear all that you have to say in this important section of Scripture. And may we be changed people because of it. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I apologize ahead of time. This is going to be rough. I spent the majority of my time on the sermon, naturally, this week. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to go through this material. It's a big cut and paste job from all of the notes from all throughout the, I'll call it a semester. But this is week 13, so we've spent the last 12 weeks going through Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. We went through Matthew 24 in quite a bit of detail, and Matthew 25, we went through that very quickly, the parables of the kingdom and stuff. So always want to remind you that we have already, before we even open the Gospel of Matthew, we have a framework for eschatology that comes from the Old Testament, okay? And it comes from the book of Daniel mostly, but all the other prophets contribute to that, okay? And we have this framework. We went over it for, a year and a half when we studied Daniel. We were very careful, at least for the most part, to only include those items in Daniel that are absolutely taught there. So there will be lots of expositors that would add more detail. That wasn't our intent. We wanted to know what was exactly clearly taught, and that framework is our background. It's kind of our input into the Gospel of Matthew. Here's our Daniel diagram that we constructed. Basically comes from the 70 weeks prophecy, and you know or recall that all the way to the left side of this diagram, there was a whole nother section that covered the other three Gentile kingdoms and the dates for those: Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greek Empire. And we put all of that stuff out there to the left. It's not included on this part. And what the Gospel of Matthew is really going to focus on is the right part of our Daniel framework. Okay, the 70th week of Daniel. We already have that framework. We know there will be a period of 7 years in the future. It is split in the middle, 3.5 years, 3.5 years, by an event, the abomination of desolation. And at the end of that tribulation period, okay, the Son of Man comes in the clouds of heaven, which we've seen is a direct reference to the second coming. And so what we have to insist here as we're going through Matthew and his eschatology is that Matthew can in no way change this framework. It can add details. There may be some additional temporal type markers in there, but Matthew or any other eschatology text in the New Testament can't overwrite this framework. Now, why do we insist on that? Because this framework was developed from inspired Scripture. Okay? Matthew can't change the nature of this framework. Okay? And that is one of the main things that we want to insist as we're going through. If you get nothing else from this summary, it is that Matthew's data here in 24 and 25 has to fit in this framework, okay? Now, one of the main differences that causes perturbations and different eschatological views is what expositors believe is the intended audience for the material here in Matthew 24. You recall that Matthew is a gospel to what group of people? To Jews. Now, how do we know that? Right from the get-go in Matthew 1. What does Matthew start with? Starts with the genealogy of Christ that was important to establish that the Lord Jesus was a direct descendant of David, okay, and he provides this genealogy in Matthew. And in all different places, there is much in Matthew that's assumed. Okay, now how about Mark? What about the Gospel of Mark? Who was Mark written to? Okay, Mark was written to Gentiles. So in places in Mark, you will see Mark actually have to explain some Jewish customs in more detail. Okay, or perhaps translate. Okay, transliterate Aramaic type words. Okay, because he's writing to Gentiles who would be unfamiliar with some Jewish customs and stuff, Mark actually takes the time to explain those things. Whereas Matthew doesn't bother. Jews already know these things, so he wouldn't go into some detail. You know, and in the same way, the whole pericope of eschatology that Jesus pronounced, that's recorded in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21 and in Mark 13, each one of those writers and disciples heard everything that Jesus said. But because they have a purpose in their writing, they would include different details to suit their purpose. Okay, Matthew was writing to Jews, so his primary purpose, how do the events of eschatology affect the Jewish nation? That was his utmost concern. And whereas Luke is concerned, who did he write to? He wrote to Theophilus, probably a Greek official in the Roman government. Okay, he was probably, one of the reasons why Luke mentions the destruction of Jerusalem in his gospel is because he was probably writing to a Roman official in the government of Greek descent. So it would be of interest to him as a Roman official to know, here's Rome's role is going to be in the destruction of Jerusalem. So now, many people interpret the entire Matthew 24 teaching in light of just one verse, and that is verse 34. Okay? It says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Okay? Now, what that actually does, if you apply and just blindly assume that generation always means the people that are alive at the time of Christ, okay? What becomes necessary then is for you to believe that all this stuff happened within 40 years or so of Christ, okay? And what you now really are forced to do is to go back in history and look at the events that happened for those 40 years or so, especially in 70 AD, and figure out how all these predictions could actually fit in that time frame. And eventually, you got to come to the point where, verse 24, 30 says, "The coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. Every eye will see him," in other portions of Scripture and things like that. Well, that didn't happen back in 70 AD. We have no record of the fulfillment of that prophecy of the second coming. So what are we forced to do if we believe that it happened? We're going to have to allegorize this somehow. We're going to have to mean the whole world will see him coming in the clouds of heaven to mean something else. Okay? And that is the real problem with using just verse 34 to guide the entire interpretation of Matthew 24. We will be getting away from literal interpretation when we do that. And we spent lots of time talking about, I think, the heretical view. Others would just say, it's an aberrational view. I think it's a heretical view of preterism, that all of this was fulfilled by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. There's no more prophecy to be fulfilled. It's all complete now. And you wonder what the whole purpose of the New Testament is now, if everything's already done and complete. So we're going to definitely be away from that. So let's come now to the text. That was kind of an introduction. The text of Matthew 24, what's the setting? Okay, the setting is the disciples and Jesus are at the temple. And one of the disciples, or some of them, said, "Oh Lord, look at the beautiful, furnishings here, and look how beautiful the buildings are. They're very ornate, and they're just pleasing to look at." And then Jesus says, what probably shocked them initially. He says, "You see all these things here that you're making, heyday about? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Okay, what is he predicting here? Okay, the temple was constructed of stones. He's predicting this temple that you see, that you're going on and on about because of its beauty, it's going to be destroyed. And presumably so is Jerusalem. Okay? They have a 2-mile walk from the temple up to the Mount of Olives. I don't know how long that would take to walk. We'd have to walk over the Muslim graveyard today and all that kind of stuff, walk up the hill. I know it'd take at least 2-3 hours for me to do it. I don't know how long it took the disciples. They certainly were in better shape. But on the way there, the disciples are contemplating what Jesus said, and oftentimes, as they've done on other occasions, they asked Jesus in private, "Hey, can you explain what you meant to us?" And they asked him that in the form of a couple of questions. Okay? He says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him, and we see, I believe it's in Mark that tells us it was 4, James, John, Peter, and one of the other ones tells us exactly who they are. They asked him, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" Okay, that's the first question. When will these things happen? What is these things that they're talking about? I believe it's a direct reference, these things, nearest antecedent, is Jesus' commentary on the stones, not being left one upon another. So the content of that first question is, when will this destruction of the temple happen? Okay, when will that happen? That's our first question. And then they say, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So they've asked them 2 questions. Some would see 3 questions. I see 2. The second one is, part A, part B. Doesn't matter, okay? But those are the questions. When will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? When will Jerusalem be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Remember, in Jewish eschatology, there were 2 ages. The present age and the Messianic age, where the kingdom is in its full glory. The Messiah rules. Israel is the chief spiritual leader of the planet, and all the Messianic blessings predicted in the Old Testament about the abundance of food and no war and the taming of the animal kingdom and on and on and on. The land boundaries for Israel, all of that will be fulfilled in the next age. So they see 2 ages, and they're asking, what's the sign of when will the end of this age happen? Okay. Now, what's interesting is that Jesus doesn't answer the first question here in Matthew. That's kind of pretty interesting. Okay, when will these things happen? When will the destruction of Jerusalem be? And you're coming in the sign of the age. Matthew doesn't record the answer to the first question. Now, how do we know that? If you go down through Matthew 24, you don't see any mention of the destruction of a temple. You don't see any destruction of the destruction of Jerusalem. Any of that stuff is recorded in Matthew 24 or Matthew 25. And so that's the only conclusion that we can make is Matthew, for whatever reason, chose not to record the first question, the answer to the first question. Okay? Only Luke, and Mark is a parallel. He doesn't either. Only Luke answers that first question about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. If you go to Luke 21, and I've just took out one blurb here, Luke 21 in verse 20, in the middle of his discussion of eschatology, he says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near." Okay, and there's on and on. A couple of other things. It goes on for 4 or 5 verses. Talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. That was the answer to the disciples' first question. Okay, so it's clear that the disciples' second question is being answered here in Matthew 24 and 25. So, yeah, Lord willing, we are going to look at Luke's eschatology in the fall, and Lord willing, if we start that class. Okay. Okay. One of the first questions that we want to ask as we're going through Matthew 24 is, where do these various sections, where do these chunks in Matthew 24, how do they lay down on our framework from Daniel? Okay, can't change it. It's got to go in there someplace. We don't want to shoehorn it in. Okay, but we already have a framework. Matthew's content should fit in there pretty nicely, and indeed I think that it does. So we talked about that first section. That first section in Matthew is verses 4 down through 14. And the first question that we kind of pondered is, okay, what is this section? Okay, is it an overview of the entire church age in one way or another? That is called the inter-advent view, and that's John Walvoord's view, that he sees that all of these things, false Christs and wars and famines and all that stuff, as happening all through continuously church history, and it culminates in the first or in the tribulation period. Okay, others would say, okay, 4 through 14 is the first half of the tribulation, because verse 15 is the abomination of desolation, which is the midpoint. So it's a natural way to split that. 4 through 14, first half, 15 through 28, second half. That's a second view of it, okay? I think the third view is the one that makes sense to me, and that is verses 4 through 14 gives an overview of the entire 7-year tribulation period. And then Matthew focuses in on the second half specifically in verses 15 through 28. Now, why is it that we think that? 2 reasons. One was the use by Matthew, it's really the use by Jesus of the birth pangs metaphor. Okay, in verse 8. He says 4 through 7, all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Beginning of birth pangs. That birth pangs concept comes from Jeremiah in the Old Testament, and it's the Jews called it the birth pangs of the Messiah, and they equated it with a time of tremendous tribulation and suffering prior to the arrival of the Messiah. Okay, and we know as we correlate some of our passages together, okay, we see the second half of the tribulation as equivalent to the birth pangs described in the Old Testament. They're also called the time of Jacob's trouble. Okay, those 3 things: second half of the tribulation, birth pangs, and the time of Jacob's trouble. All of those are equivalent. And why are they equivalent? Because each one of them has a similar characteristic that's described in verse 21. It says, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be." That is the same type of language that's used for, say, for example, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Okay? Now, when you have a time period where the tribulation and distress is worse than any other time that has existed, and it's worse than any other time that will ever be, there can only be one time frame that meets those conditions. Okay? They all have to be talking about the same thing. Okay? This is why we can comfortably put verses 15 through 28 in Matthew into this Daniel framework in the second half of the tribulation. Because Daniel chapter 12 tells us the length of that horrible time of tribulation is 3.5 years. So we can put it in that second half, and Matthew puts it in that second half here. Okay? That's the first reason why we see it. The birth pangs metaphor. It doesn't lend itself to a real long period of time. Okay? Birth pangs happen fairly quickly to a woman that's about to give birth to a child. It's a relatively short period of time. It's not a big, long, extended period of time. Okay? Some of you women that have had big, huge babies would say, "Oh, yeah, you could say that." You're, yeah, right? But the birth pang concept, it's really, the imagery is a short period of time, not a long inter-advent age type time. Okay? That's the first reason. The second reason why I think verses 4 through 14 is an overview of the entire 7 years is verse 14. It says, "The gospel of the kingdom will be preached as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." That really seems like the end. If it's only the end of the first half of the tribulation period, it seems to be building up something that is not that climactic. Okay, so those two reasons: the birth pangs metaphor, and the simple fact that verse 16 says, "The end shall come." That seems to be marking a conclusion to something. And I think it's marking the conclusion to the summary and overview of the first half of the tribulation period. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay. Now we come to verse 15, the abomination of desolation. Okay? Again, if we go back to our Daniel framework, we see that is at the midpoint. Okay, it is where the coming prince in Daniel chapter 9 breaks the covenant at the halfway point. He breaks the covenant that he made to begin Daniel's 70th week. And really verses 15 through 28, maybe some include verse 29, the cosmic signs, this is kind of focused on the second half. The initial part is the abomination of desolation. And one of the most interesting aspects of this here in Matthew, and it's also in Mark, and so I put Matthew and Mark in here. I've swapped them back and forth. There's a debate on which gospel was written first. Was Matthew written first? Was Mark written first? Either way, either Matthew or Mark makes a very important editorial comment here by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, right? How about that? An inspired editorial comment. And what is that editorial comment? He says, let the reader understand. Let the reader understand. Now think about that. The disciples are sitting there on the Mount of Olives, Okay, and Jesus is explaining the eschatology there. None of them heard, let the reader understand, right? Jesus didn't say that. Okay, if you have a red letter Bible, those letters are going to be in black. Okay, that came after the gospel was written down by Matthew and Mark. Okay, that inspired editorial comment actually gives a clue that Jesus is not primarily speaking to his disciples anymore. He is speaking to Jews that will be alive during the time of the tribulation, that have the ability to read and understand this text in Matthew. Okay? There was no reader when Jesus spoke these words. Okay? No one could read this editorial comment for years and years. Okay? And the churches didn't have a complete New Testament with all the Gospels and epistles and all of that for hundreds of years. Okay? They may have had one or two letters of Paul's here and there, but, our first, bound Bible for use in churches was hundreds of years after the writing of the New Testament. So that admonition that the leader or that the reader should understand that when they see the abomination of desolation, they're to flee. It really gives us a clue that Jesus is now talking to Jews that will be alive during that tribulation, that would actually see the abomination of desolation. Now, why did Jesus give this command to flee when they see the abomination of desolation? Well, we just go on in the text, right? That text always answers. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. Nor ever will be. Okay? So, and then the description of the second half of the tribulation goes on. Here is the updated diagram from last week. I made a couple of errors in last week's diagram. I fixed them. But if you look at the layout, that's kind of a blown up version of the right side of Daniel's framework. And we're able, I think, now to place some of the events in Matthew into Daniel's framework and include just a diagram of the events of Matthew 24 and 25. So what do we have? We have a 7-year span, Daniel's 70th week. It's split into two pieces by the abomination of desolation. Okay, many people see the first half of the tribulation in verses 4 through 8 in Matthew, and those describe the beginning of birth pangs. And what are the characteristics? There are false Christs, there's wars, there's famines, there's earthquakes. Okay, those are the general characteristics of the first half of the tribulation period. And then the second half, that's called the Great Tribulation, okay, the time of Jacob's trouble. And in the birth pangs metaphor, those would be the equivalent to the hard birth pangs just before for birth. And so there you're going to have persecution of the Jews. You're going to have false prophets and false Christs. Now, the difference between these false Christs and false prophets with respect to, say the first half of the tribulation, the false Christs, these false Christs and prophets are able to perform miraculous signs. Okay, a little bit different than that first half. So in the second half, you're going to have the added complexity of these false Christs and prophets producing various miracles and things like that. You got the proclamation of the gospel by the angel in Revelation chapter 14. Okay, I think it correlates to verse 14 in Matthew 24. This gospel will be preached in the whole world. Okay, not only by, the two witnesses and the 144,000 and any people that get saved during the tribulation, but the angelic being in heaven is proclaiming the gospel during that time. Okay, and then you have going into some of the other chapters. We'll get to that. So that kind of covers the tribulation period, and we certainly took pause at some instances here. The one that I just want to make mention is verse 22. Okay, verse 22. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Okay, I think it's an interesting use of Jesus in using tense here in the Greek text. Okay, unless those days had been cut short, past tense. Okay, those days will be cut short, future tense. Now, if this is a future event, how could Jesus say, in the past tense, those days had been cut short? Okay, I think he uses the past tense to infer that God, in his sovereignty, okay, in his omniscient knowledge of the future, okay, he is saying here that he purposefully planned to put an end to the second half of the tribulation. He purposefully planned an end to that, because if he allowed it to continue indefinitely, there would be no life left on earth. It's that bad that second half of the tribulation is going to be. Okay, so it's a kind of a sovereignty type quotation here. Unless those days were cut short by the Lord in his infinite knowledge. Okay, if he doesn't end the second half of that tribulation, nobody would survive it. It's going to be that bad. So he purposefully decided to put that to an end before everyone was dead. Okay, interesting. One of the aspects, again, is great signs and wonders. There's also a little blurb there. Those great signs and wonders to mislead, if possible, even the elect. And what Jesus is telling us is those miracles that will be performed in the second half of the tribulation will be so miraculous and convincing that believers could be deceived. But then Jesus puts that to bed with the phrase, if that were possible. I think he's saying it's not going to be possible for a believer to be deceived, but these miracles are going to be so convincing. Okay, if that were possible, even believers would be deceived. Okay, they'll be that convincing, which is scary. What hope does that have for unbelievers? Not very much. Okay, it kind of brings to mind, and we'll look at that passage eventually, perhaps in the fall when we look at Thessalonians, the two epistles there. Okay, strong delusion that the Lord will give to unbelievers because they refuse to believe the truth. I think these miracles by the false Christ and false prophet, the false prophet, I think, even then, are going to be very convincing. Now, as we go through the book of Revelation, and we hate to jump ahead, but we just want to mention it. One of the things that the false prophet is going to have the power to do is what? He's going to set up an image of the Antichrist. We call him the beast there. Okay, in the temple. Okay, and everyone that doesn't worship this statue will be killed. Okay, mark of the beast comes in there, but one of the powers that this false prophet is going to have is he will have the ability to bring that statue to life. That's a pretty deceptive miracle, is it not? That's going to be a tough one for people in the world to swallow. So that's the scale of the deception that is going to happen, especially in the second half of the tribulation period. Okay. At the end, some people would put verse 29 as part of that second half of the tribulation period with the cosmic signs and things like that. But those cosmic signs seem to be associated with the second coming. Okay, in verse 30, you have the second coming of Christ coming in the clouds of heaven, which is a direct Old Testament quote from Daniel chapter 7, it'd be verse 13, coming of the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven. And here in verse 30, it says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Okay, there's some speculation on what that sign is. Is that sign separate and distinct from just the second coming? Okay, yeah, there are some expositors that say, yeah, it's a different sign than the second coming, viewing the whole world, seeing the second coming. What could that sign be? It's all speculation. There isn't anything in the text to hint, if there is a separate sign, what that sign is. Okay, maybe Jesus told the disciples what it was, and none of the Gospels record it. That's certainly possible too. But we don't have any information in the text. And then you have verse 31. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. They will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. We had a kind of a lively discussion. Keon was the one that asked the most pointed questions about verse 31. And so, this sermon today, you can all blame on Keon, because she's the one that prompted me to study some of this stuff out, because I really felt I didn't answer your question well enough. So for the last month, I've been going through Scripture and reading some commentaries and translating some passages and going back into the Old Testament. It really, out of her question, comes today's sermon. So I will fully kind of summarize why verse 31 is not a post-trib rapture. It's very important, because those that believe the post-trib rapture, they look at this and say, hey, you got everything you need in here. The second coming and then the rapture. You got the gathering together of the elect from the four winds of the sky, and you got the great trumpet. And you go into the three passages that we use for the rapture passages, John 14, 1 Corinthians 15, and 1 Thessalonians 4. And they say, it all fits. So the rapture is right after the tribulation period. And I'll deal with why that's not true in the sermon very quickly. But just to give you a very quick highlight, the term elect here is not a technical term for the church. The term actually begins in the Old Testament as a term of description for the nation of Israel. Okay? As a matter of fact, in I believe it is Isaiah 45:5, it blatantly says in the King James, Israel is my elect. It uses the word elect in the King James. NASB uses the word chosen, but that concept all through the Old Testament, that Israel is God's chosen people. It's His chosen nation that He's set apart from all other nations of the world. That's all throughout the Old Testament, and that's the very definition of elect. Okay? So, elect is not a technical term for the church here in verse 31. Okay? If I can get my thoughts together. The second reason, boy, I hate to go look at my notes. I didn't write it in the notes here. But, yeah.
While you're looking,
yeah, I got it.
we're going to blame something on Keon. The second thing we're going to blame is on my son Brett, who preached last Sunday on Isaiah 60.
Okay.
And this is an amazing verse, that verse 12, talking about the children of Israel. Who are these who fly like a cloud? And
Interesting.
pretty interesting phrase, because
Okay.
you think, and the context there is the Brett was explaining, are the Jews coming back from all over the world. There's millions and millions.
Mm-hmm.
And who would have thought fly like a cloud? Whether you think that's planes or how God does it is amazing.
Mm-hmm. It's one passage that I hadn't considered. It's not going to be my objective to talk about this gathering in Matthew 31 primarily, but I did include some passages that talk about this gathering in the Old Testament. That's not one of them. So thank you. That just makes it harder. Now I got to go back and add some more. Yes, sir.
Doesn't the context show that it might be the beginning of the Messianic kingdom?
Yes, absolutely. Especially the references in the Old Testament that I'm going to cover in the sermon. Absolutely. This is a Messianic kingdom, the start of it. Okay, and we'll fully explain to that. So, good question. So, first reason, elect is not a term for the church. Okay, you have another one, Keon? This is trouble. Yes.
It's a bunch of 31st gathering. This is not the church. This is for Jews.
Yes, this is the nation of Israel. And we're going to look at the Old Testament passages. See, because if you have a reference Bible, the reference for this verse is probably Exodus 19:16. If you go back to Exodus 19:16, you're going to scratch your head. How is this a reference for this gathering in verse 31 here in Matthew 24? You'll scratch your head. The only similarity is the blast of a trumpet. That's the only similarity in Exodus 19. I think there's a different verse that Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament here, and we're going to look at that. It has all the elements of this verse 31, and it'll be clear. This is a gathering of the nation of Israel. It's not a gathering of the church. The church is already gone. We're gone. Okay? That's right. The church is not in Matthew 24. The church has left the scene. Well, the rapture. And we'll talk about that in the fall too. That's on the plate to discuss. We want to look at all the passages in the New Testament that teach the rapture. Because for the most part, expositors, they do a fluffy job with that. They don't go into enough detail that gives you confidence that the rapture is true. And we're going to put that to bed. We're going to study it out in as much detail as it takes, and then it'll be clear. Okay. As a matter of fact, if we go all the way back to Daniel chapter 9, what is the first thing that Gabriel says to Daniel before he gives him the prophecy of the 70 weeks? Okay. What is the content and the purpose for the prophecy? Remember, it's for, let's go there. Let me, real quick, I'll read it. You guys don't have to go there, but I'll read it. Daniel chapter 9. Here is Jeremiah. He says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and for the holy city. This is a prophecy about the Jews alone, okay, and Jerusalem, the temple, that kind of stuff. That is the purpose of these 70 weeks. If the entire purpose for that 7-year tribulation period is for God to finally deal with the Jews as a nation, why would the church be involved in that? Yeah.
Okay. So those are 7-year, middle of a 7-year, is talking about abomination and desolation set on the holy place.
Yeah.
Okay. It's that talking about temple, right?
That's right.
Okay. As far as I know, there's no temple.
That's right.
So
Yes.
it's going to be built.
Yes.
And, this is
Yes.
according to here.
Right.
The chart,
Absolutely.
in the church age.
Yes, there must be. Well, let me give you two possibilities. Okay, here's the thing. The start of the tribulation period is not an imminent event. Okay, what is an imminent event? An imminent event is an event that could happen at any time. Nothing must happen before an imminent event takes place. Some things could happen, but nothing must happen. But the start of the tribulation period is not an imminent event. The rapture is an imminent event. The start of the tribulation period is not. What must happen prior to the start of the tribulation period. How does the tribulation period start? In Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, it starts with the covenant made between the Antichrist and the nation of Israel. So of necessity, the tribulation period couldn't start until there is a nation of Israel. And in 70 AD, that was all gone. And for 2,000 almost years, there was no nation of Israel. There must be a nation of Israel to start the tribulation period. Okay? That has in fact happened in 1948. Okay? The tribulation couldn't have started before 1948 because there was no nation. Now, an equally important factor, I'm really getting off the notes here, but that's okay. Good question. The other factor concerning the temple, it also happens that the temple could not have been constructed before 1967 in the 6-Day War. Why is that? Because the Syrians controlled the eastern part of Jerusalem, which includes the Temple Mount. Okay? At the end of that 6-Day War, now Israel had all of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. Now they're in control of that. They can decide when a new temple is created. Now I'll give you two possibilities. Okay? We know that the temple must be in existence at the midpoint of the tribulation period, right? That means two things, one of two things. Either the temple is constructed before the start of the tribulation period. Okay? That could be in our day, before the rapture. They could begin the construction of the temple while we're still here. That's a possibility. But it's also a possibility that it won't begin until the tribulation begins. That's another possibility, that the temple is constructed once the tribulation begins. And I think there's maybe some merit to that, because that covenant that the Antichrist signs with Israel, okay, it really seems to be for peace and security of the Jewish nation at that point. And so it makes sense that if it is a covenant to guarantee, the safety and security of the nation of Israel against all of its enemies, then at that point, starting to create a temple wherever it's supposed to be, seems like that would, the Antichrist would offer some protection for the Jews to do that. They construct a temple, it's going to inflame the entire world, especially if they start killing animals, right? PETA's going to go nuts, okay? Okay. Keon exhausts me. Yes?
The way Israel's acting right now,
Yes.
do you think that they're following God's way or are they not?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It is mostly a secular nation. There are very, very few believing Jews. And I'm going to make reference to why the current, I mean, the whole sermon today is, how are we to view the current nation of Israel? What are we to think about it? How do we view it? Because we understand these prophecies of future blessing that are going to come in the Messianic age at the second coming of Christ. But what we see now isn't even close to that.
They are in apostasy.
Yeah. I mean, this is a secular, most Jews are at best agnostic and at worst atheists. Okay? The entire nation. There is no spiritual life there. Very few. There are certainly some, plenty of Messianic Jews, believing Jews. Avi from our tour, I believe he is a Messianic Jew. There are other Messianic Jews. And I'm certainly going to draw some material from Messianic Jews that have written about prophecy in print. Okay, all right. So go back to the reasons why this isn't a post-trib rapture, and we'll have to wrap it up here real quick. First, the elect is not a technical term for the church. The second reason is you have angelic involvement here in verse 31. It is actually the angels that are gathering up the elect. And if you go and look at the three rapture passages that are typically used, okay, to prove and outline the doctrine of the rapture, you will not see angelic involvement in the mechanics of the rapture. Okay, here you see angelic involvement. They're the ones transporting the elect back to Israel. Okay, you don't see angelic involvement. Go through those passages. That's one thing I had to cut out of the sermon to keep it under an hour. Okay. That's one thing I had to cut out. And then thirdly, I think this is the most humorous aspect to why verse 31 is not a post-trib rapture of believers. Okay? Let's set the scene again. The second coming has happened. Jesus is coming back to earth. Before he gets here, at the end of the tribulation period, just before he gets there, he raptures all believers from the earth in this scheme, right? So all believers are removed from the earth. Then Jesus comes the rest of the way, and you sit and you wonder, well, why is that the blessed hope? We just went through the entire tribulation, and our reward is to be raptured just right at the end? How's that a blessed hope? Okay? So people that see a post-tribulational rapture here, I have a question for them. Jesus comes, he raptures all believers up with him, and then comes down. Who are the sheep in the sheep and the goats parable, judgment in Matthew 25? There aren't any believers on the earth. Who are the sheep? Right? When we looked at the sheep and the goats parable, judgment, last week, who were the sheep? Believing Gentiles. Who were the goats? Unbelieving Gentiles. Who were these brothers of mine? The believing Jews that has just been gathered in verse 31 back to Israel from all over the world. Believing Jews. We looked at that last week. That's what I think. There's a third group of people here. Those Jews actually witnessed the sheep and the goats judgment, the judgment of the Gentiles. Okay? I haven't heard any post-tribulational exegete even address, where's the sheep? The sheep are gone. Who are the sheep here then? Most of them, they just ignore that because it's a huge contradiction. Okay, so for those three reasons, this gathering of the elect from the one end of the sky to another, a worldwide regathering here in verse 31, is not a rapture. Okay, now I kind of call it I think it's a Jewish rapture. It's Jewish believers from all over the world, okay, miraculously with angelic transport, okay, all brought back to Israel from the four corners of the earth. And that is one of the main points in the first part of the sermon. We're going to look at the passages in the Old Testament that actually predict this gathering in verse 31 in Matthew 24. Okay? You can look at I got another page here about the only thing that is left to really discuss is the meaning of this generation. I fully covered it about 6-7 weeks ago. I cut and pasted most of it here. You can look at that, and I think probably right now I'm anxious a little bit about this sermon, so I want to relax and stop the Sunday school class here. Okay, any questions or comments or anything like that, please. Snide remarks from anyone except my wife.
Talking about something humorous.
Yeah.
Is it J. Vernon McGee? I don't know who
I love that guy, yeah.
who said that this post-tribulation rapture view, it turns the marriage supper of the Lamb into a bag lunch.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. Not only that, if you look at it that way, one thing Chad kind of says in jest occasionally, but if the church goes through the tribulation and isn't raptured to the end, that's the effect of Jesus beating his wife, right? That's what it is. God's wrath is going to be poured out on us during the tribulation. That's what it boils down to. So, yeah, a bag lunch. That's a great line. J. Vernon McGee. He always comes up with the good ones. I always have liked him. You know, you travel across the country, you go on the AM dial, you're going to find him preaching somewhere still. Yeah, that's right. They have his recordings, and I don't know how long he's been with the Lord. It's been quite a while, but radio stations do not stop playing his sermons because they're so good, and they're lots of imagery and flamboyance. He really was a good. What was his show? Walk Through the Bible or something like that? I forget. But okay. Through the Bible. Yes, Alden.
So you studied this probably more than most of us, and not all of us. What's one of the big takeaways for you that you've learned in teaching this semester?
In Matthew, I think it has re-solidified that the end of chapter 3, where Jesus is, it's this generation, that whole theme through there, and why it can't mean only the people Jesus was talking to, is he uses that collective you at the end of chapter 23. Okay, when he says that you killed the prophets, and obviously the people that were listening, the Pharisees and Sadducees that he pronounced the woes on, obviously they weren't there when Zacharias was killed between the altar and stuff. But he assigned blame to them. And that's a clue that says that Jesus was saying that you are the type of generation, just like the ones, rebellious, unbelieving Jews that killed the prophets. So he's using you in a collective sense to mean this generation. And I really believe that this generation, when he says it in I think it's verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He's predicting a future rebellious generation, okay, that is going to witness all of the tribulation, the abomination of desolation, all of it, and yet at the end they will pass away because they're unbelieving. Okay, we're waiting for that generation. Of course, we as the church, we're waiting for the rapture, an imminent event. A whole bunch of stuff related to the tribulation could begin, okay, prior to that, but nothing must happen before the rapture. Okay, there are some things that must happen before the start of the tribulation. Some of those have already happened. The nation becoming Israel becoming a nation in 1948, control of Jerusalem itself in 1967, and you can see lots of different things going on in the world today, in that part of the world. That's really the two-pronged reason why I decided on this particular topic for the sermon. It's current events. It's what's going on over there in the Middle East, and Keon's questions from verse 31 about the gathering, okay, of Jews. So,
I love what you said about the Matthew 24:15. Let the reader be aware. Let the reader understand.
yeah,
I mean, the way I believe is that there's going to be so many Jews that have to fit this passage, in my opinion. Their eyes are going to be open,
yes,
and I think they're going to be reading the Bible.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. When it come to Matthew 24, it's like, wow, it's happening right before our eyes. Yeah. Yep. All right. The end of a long and hard-fought class.